hello friends, hello G's, it's your boy again, falling with a star. So guys, today we are going to look at basic tissues. And one thing you have to know is that the human body consists primarily of four basic tissues. And we have the epithelial tissue, the connective tissue, the nervous tissue, and also the muscle tissue. As you know that tissues comes together to form organs. So for every organ that you take in the human body, it contains all these four tissues. For example, when you take the lip is an organ. It has this surface membrane called the epithelial tissue. And these epithelial tissues, they are being held in place by another tissue we call the connective tissue. That's why we call them connective tissue. You understand? You see, when you bite your mouth, you can feel it, and this is because this organ called the lip contains another tissue we call the nervous tissue. Hope you understand. And you are able to talk to your friend, open your mouth, because of the help of this tissue we call the muscle tissue. But today we are going to look at the epithelial tissue. Now my question is, what is epithelium? What is epithelium? Maybe you've heard it before, but my question is, what is epithelium? One may say epithelium actually is being made up of closely packed cells. It's made up of closely packed cells. So you can see that these are the epithelial cells, and they are closely packed. You understand? And they rest on a basement membrane. They rest on a basement membrane. So this is the basement membrane. You understand? And this basement membrane actually separates this epithelial tissue from the underlying connective tissue. So beneath every epithelial tissue, there is this underlying connective tissue, and what separates them is the basement membrane. Hope you understand. And this basement membrane actually consists of two parts. One part is being contributed by the epithelial tissue, and the other part is being contributed by the connective tissue. So the part contributed by the epithelial tissue, we call that part the basal lamina. So when you look at this, the superior part is called the basal lamina, contributed by the epithelial tissue. And the lower part is called the reticular lamina, and this is being contributed by the connective tissue. Hope you understand. Now let's look at some of the characteristics of epithelial tissue. Already we know that the epithelial cells are closely packed, meaning that there is little or no intercellular space. So there is no space between them. They are closely packed. You understand? So that's one characteristics of epithelial tissue. They are also avascular. Epithelial tissue, you don't have blood vessels. So epithelial tissues are avascular. They don't have blood vessels. So how do they get their blood supply? You see, I said that beneath every epithelial tissue, there is a connective tissue, and this connective tissue contains blood vessels, and these blood vessels supplies these epithelial cells. Hope you understand. But look at this. Let's say that this is the epithelial cell. This is an epithelial cell. Look at what it is saying. It's saying that, but I have nerves. So epithelial cells, they have nerves. Hope you understand. So they are innervated. They also show polarity. When I say they show polarity, let's take a look at this epithelial cell. You can see that this epithelial cell has this topmost part called the apical surface, and it has this base part called the basal surface. And the nature of the apical surface and the basal surface, they are different, and that's why we say the epithelial cells, they show polarity. And the basal surface, as you know, they rest on this membrane called the basement membrane. Hope you understand. But there is this epithelial tissue. This epithelial tissue, it actually falls under epithelial tissues. But one thing about this epithelial tissue is that it lacks apical surface. Indirectly, I'm trying to tell you that it doesn't show polarity. So epithelial tissue, they don't have apical surface. They can be found in what? Sebaceous glands. Hope you understand. But not only sebaceous glands, but that is the example I'm giving for now. Sebaceous glands. Now, my friends, let's look at the arrangement of what? Epithelial tissue. The arrangement of epithelial tissue. You see that this epithelial tissue, or the epithelial cells, they are being arranged basically in two ways. In how many ways? In how many ways? In two ways. You understand? The first one is these epithelial cells, they can be arranged in a long sheet of cells. They can be arranged in a long sheet of cells like this. You can see that they've been arranged in a long sheet of cells. And this epithelial arrangement, we call it the membranous what? Epithelium. So this arrangement forms what we call the membranous what? Epithelium. And this membranous epithelium is very important. Why am I saying that? Because when you look at the external body surface, they are the ones that covers the what? The external what? Body surface, like the dermis of the skin. The dermis of the skin. They also cover the internal cavities. Internal cavities like the pleural cavity, where you can find your lungs, the one that helps you in breathing. You understand? That cavity is being lined by what? This what? Membranous what? Epithelium. For example, the pericardial cavity too, it is being lined by what? This membranous what? Epithelium. They also cover blood vessels. When you look at a blood vessel, you can see this is a blood vessel. These are the membranous epithelium. These are the epithelial cells. You understand? And they actually covers what? The inside of what? The blood vessels, and they are referred to as endothelial. So the epithelial cells here are collectively called what? Endothelium. One thing I didn't say when I was talking about the internal cavities is that the epithelial cells that actually covers what? The internal cavities, we call them mesothelium. We call them what? Mesothelium. Mesothelium. You understand? They also what? Cover what? Body tubes like the GIT and the respiratory tract. Hope you understand. Another way that these epithelial cells are being arranged is that sometimes in some parts of our body, these epithelial cells, they dip into the what? The connective tissue to form what? Glands. To form what? Glands. You understand? So sometimes these epithelial cells, they dip into the connective tissue and they form what? Glands. Hope you understand. Now let's look at the functions of this epithelial tissue. So now the functions. One thing I will not forget when I'm talking about epithelial tissue is that they are for protection. When you look at the skin is actually protecting the internal organs, and the skin has this what? Epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissues, they are for what? Protection. They are also for secretion. When you look at your stomach, the cavity is being lined by what? These epithelial what? Cells. And these epithelial cells actually secrete acid, which is HCl, and also what? Pepsin. You see that one thing we know about the stomach is that it secretes what? Acid. And this acid is being secreted by what? The epithelial what? Cells. So they are for secretion. They are also for absorption. When you look at your small intestine, you see that we say absorption actually takes place in the small intestine, and it is by the help of these what? Epithelial cells. You understand? They are also for sensory. They also have what? Sensory function. When you look at your ear have this epithelial cells that actually helps it to sense sound. You understand? And also when you look at your nose, the nasal cavity has this olfactory area which is being lined by this olfactory epithelium, which helps in sensing what? Smell. Hope you understand. So now let's look at junctional complexes. Junctional what? Complexes. When I was talking about the epithelial cell, I said that they are closely packed. They are closely packed. And since I said the epithelial cells are tightly packed or closely packed, they are held by what? Junctional cell complexes. They are held by what? Junctional what? Cell complexes. And one thing about these junctional cell complexes is that they are being placed at the basolateral part of the cell. They are being placed at the what? Basolateral part of the cell. You see, when let's say that this is our cell, this part, this surface is called what? The apical surface. And from here, passing this part is referred to as the basolateral what? Surface. So these junctional cell complexes, they are being placed at this basolateral what? Surface. And now let's look at the junctional complexes. The first one that we will look at is called tight junction. Called what? Tight junction. Look at the name, tight junction. It is also called occluding what? Junction. It's actually held, or it actually holds the cells together and actually regulates selective movement of what? Solutes across what? The epithelium. You understand? So when you look at these tight junctions, you can see that it is holding these cells tightly what? Together, and actually helps regulate what? Selective movement of solutes across what? The epithelium. Now let's look at the second one, called gap junction. Gap junction. And this gap junction is also called the communicative junction because it helps in communication. It helps the cells to communicate, and cells, they communicate by the use of what? Ions. You understand? So this gap junction is actually being formed. It's actually being formed by what? 6 proteins. It is actually being formed by 6 proteins. Let's count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 proteins. And these proteins are called cornisine. But when they come together to form this gap junction, we call them what? Cornisone. Hope you get it. You understand? And it helps cells to what? Communicate. Now let's look at the last one. The last one is called anchoring junction. This anchoring junction is further divided into 3 parts. We have the first part called desmosomes. And these desmosomes, they are linked to what? Intermediate filaments. You can see that they are being linked to what? Intermediate filaments. We also have the next one called hemidesmosomes. And it is also being linked to what? Intermediate filaments. The last one is called adherence what? Junction. And this adherence junction, is it being linked to intermediate filament? No, it is being linked to what? Actin what? Filament. So we have desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, and adherence junction forming what we call the anchoring what? Junction. So now let's look at surface modifications of these epithelial cells. You see, sometimes the apical surface of these epithelial cells are being modified. And the first modification that we are looking at is called the microvilli, which is a finger-like projections on the surface epithelium. You understand? So this is the surface epithelium. You can see that it has these finger-like projections, and they are called what? Microvilli. And these microvilli, depending on the location, depending on where they are being found, they can be called striations or what? Brush border. Striations, when you find them in the what? In the GIT, gastrointestinal tract. For example, when you find them in the small intestine, you call them what? Striations. When you find them in the urinary system, you can call them, or you call them what? Brush borders. You understand? So brush borders in the urinary system and striations in the what? In the GIT. That's for microvilli. And its function is that it helps in what? absorption. It helps in absorption. That's why they are being found in the small intestine, and that is why the small intestine is said to help in absorption of end products of digestion. Hope you get it. Now the next one that I'll talk about is the cilia. You see that these cilia, they are these things that can be found on the apical surface of this epithelial cell. You understand? And these cilia, they are for movement. You understand? They are for movement. And mostly wherever you find cilia, you find this wine-shaped cells called goblet cells. Wine-shaped cells called goblet cells. And these goblet cells, they actually secrete what we call mucus. Hope you understand. So wherever you see cilia, it's likely that you see goblet cells, because they produce the mucus, and the cilia beats them to the upper respiratory tract for you to either swallow them or spit them out. Hope you understand. Yes. So now the last one that I'm going to talk about, it's not actually the last one. It's called stereocilia. Stereocilia. Because of the word cilia, someone might think that it is also a type of cilia. No, it is not a type of cilia, my friends. It is a type of microvilli. Why am I saying that? Because this stereocilia is for absorption, not for movement. It's for absorption, and also for sensory function. They are long and branched. That's their difference. The difference between stereocilia and cilia. They are long and branched, and they are for absorption and sensory function. Later, when we look at the types of the epithelial cells, we will look at another modification called keratinization. Keratinization. Sure. And let me say this last thing. These surface modification, they are exclusively for cuboidal and columnar cells. Cuboidal and columnar cells. Specifically for simple columnar and cuboidal cells, or for pseudostratified cells. So for these three things, either simple columnar or simple cuboidal or pseudostratified epithelial cells. You understand? Sure. So now let's look at the types of epithelial tissue. The types of epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue can actually be classified based on the number of layers. The number of layers. Sometimes you can have a single layer, and we call that simple. Simple, like a single layer. It is simple. Sometimes you can have a multiple layer of cells, and that's one we call it stratified. So you can have simple epithelial cells or stratified epithelial cells. And one thing about stratified epithelial cells is that they don't have surface modifications. Hope you understand. The epithelial cells can also be classified based on the shape of the cell. Sometimes the cell can be flat like this, and we call that squamous. So that means the shape of the cell is squamous or flat. And this is the nucleus. You can see that the nucleus too is flat, because in rare time session, sometimes you don't see the layers of the cell. You can only see the nucleus. So the nucleus will help you to know that this is squamous, or this is this, or this is that. Hope you understand. It can also be cuboidal. Cuboidal, you understand? It looks like a cube. The width is the same as the height. You understand? And it has a centrally placed nuclei. You understand? And this nuclei is circular. You understand? We also have columnar. We also have columnar cells, and they are taller than wide. And you can see that their nucleus is close to the basal surface. Hope you understand. So one thing I want you guys to note is that the epithelial tissue is named by combining the number of layers and the shape of the cell. For example, when I have something like this, I know that this is only a single layer, so simple, and the shape too is what it looks like the cells are flat, so squamous. So this will be what simple squamous what epithelial what tissue. When you look at this simple, the cells look cuboidal, so this is a simple what cuboidal epithelial tissue. Same applies to this simple what columnar. But when you look at the stratified squamous, you see that stratified squamous is actually being made up of multi-layer or multi-layered what cells. And how will you know that this is cuboidal, this is squamous, this is columnar? You can know that by looking at what the topmost part. If the topmost part cells are squamous, that stratified epithelial tissue will be what squamous. For example, this, consider looking at the basal side is columnar, this is cuboidal, but the topmost part is what the cells are flat. You understand? So this will be squamous and it is stratified. So this will be what stratified squamous what epithelial tissue. Let me say this about stratified squamous epithelial tissue. One thing about them is that there is something about them that can help you to identify them easily, and that thing is when you look at their basal part or the basal membrane part, you can see that the epithelial tissue actually dips in the connective tissue to form these structures. It dips in the connective tissue to form these structures, and these structures we call them the epithelial pecs. Epithelial pecs. And you can see that the connective tissues they move or they dip into the epithelial tissue to form this thing here called connective tissue papilla. So this is connective tissue papilla, and these things are called the epithelial pecs. They are specifically for stratified squamous. They are only for stratified squamous. So when you see these things, automatically you know that you are looking at stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Sometimes these stratified squamous epithelial tissue, they also have this thing we call keratinization, what I talked about. Sometimes when you look at the topmost part cells, you can see that they don't have nuclei and they are being filled with keratin. So we called that stratified squamous keratinized. For example, let's say that this is stratified squamous, and when you look at the surface, you can see that there is this thing here, and here the cells there, they don't have nuclei. They don't have nuclei, and they are being filled with keratin. You can see it's pinkish when you look at when you guys are looking at them microscopically. You can see that place becomes pinkish, and that means that these cells, they are being keratinized, and that's epithelial tissue becomes stratified squamous keratinized. Sometimes they don't have this keratinization. You understand? And this keratinization is exclusively for only stratified squamous. So stratified squamous can either be keratinized or non-keratinized. We also have another one called parakeratinization. That parakeratinization occurs when the epithelial cells, they don't lose their nuclei. They have their nuclei, but they are being filled with keratin. For that part, we don't say that the uppermost part is keratinized, but we say that it is parakeratinized. Hope you understand. You have to also know where you can find these epithelial tissues. For example, simple squamous can be found in blood vessels, can be found in internal cavities like pericardial cavity, pleural cavity. You must know all these things, and I will post these things at the end of the video. Hope you understand. So this is all for epithelial tissue. Thank you.